Tonight's episode is brought to you by Black Diamond Authors, an independent publishing house dedicated to gripping, thought-provoking books that keep you on the edge of your seat. From true crime puzzle books to interactive mystery experiences, they offer a unique way to engage with the stories that fascinate us. If you love unraveling mysteries, check them out at blackdiamondauthors.com.
All right, everybody, welcome back for another deep dive. And today's going to be a good one. We are going all the way back to Victorian London to explore one of the most infamous unsolved cases in history. You guessed it, Jack the Ripper. And we might even have an answer to who he was. That's right. There's a claim that Jack the Ripper has finally been identified using DNA evidence. We're going to be looking at a People magazine article that breaks down this investigation, and we've got a fantastic expert here to help us really dissect it. So let me quickly set the stage for you. It's 1888. The fog is thick in Whitechapel, and fear is gripping the city as a killer stalks the streets. 5 brutal murders later, Jack the Ripper vanished into the shadows, leaving behind a mystery that has captivated the world for over a century. But now a shawl found at one of the crime scenes is offering some potential clues. Now, before we get into all the details about this intriguing piece of evidence, let me quickly mention something else that might pique your interest. This deep dive is brought to you by Black Diamond Authors. If you're a fan of true crime mystery and stories that keep you on the edge of your seat, then you have got to check out their collection of books. They've got something for every mystery lover, from puzzle books to interactive experiences. So head over to https://blackdiamondauthors.com and explore their world. Okay, back to Jack the Ripper. The central figure in this story is Russell Edwards, a British researcher who believes he solved the mystery using a shawl. So let's talk about the evidence. How important is physical evidence in a case this old, and what are the challenges of working with materials from the 1800s?
Well, physical evidence is often seen as the most reliable link to the past, right? However, working with materials from the 1800s presents some unique challenges. Things degrade over time, they get contaminated, and this can make analysis pretty difficult.
So it sounds like this shawl is a crucial piece of the puzzle.
Yeah.
This shawl belonged to Catherine Eddowes, the 4th victim. Edwards bought it in 2007, and it supposedly has blood and semen stains on it.
That's right.
Okay, so then walk me through the DNA analysis. How do scientists even begin to compare samples that old to potential suspects today?
Well, scientists were able to isolate DNA from the stains on the shawl. Then they compared that DNA to modern-day descendants of Catherine Eddowes and a suspect. The fact that they were able to get any usable DNA from a shawl this old is pretty incredible in itself.
And the suspect that they identified through this DNA analysis is Aaron Kosminski. He was a 23-year-old Polish barber living in Whitechapel at the time of the murders. And this is where it gets really interesting, because Kosminski was actually already a suspect in the original investigation, wasn't he?
Yeah, he was. He was definitely on their radar back then, but they just didn't have enough to arrest him. So it makes you wonder if maybe they were onto something all those years ago, and now this DNA evidence is backing that up.
Exactly. Makes you wonder what they might have missed back then. Now, in the article, Edwards describes Kosminski as a barber surgeon. I thought that was a fascinating detail considering the nature of the Ripper's crimes. His profession might have given him a certain level of anatomical knowledge.
Oh, absolutely. Back in the late 19th century, barbers often did minor surgical procedures too, bloodletting, tooth extractions, things like that. So it's definitely an interesting detail to consider. But of course, we have to be careful not to jump to conclusions.
Of course, we can't just connect the dots based on a few details. Now, Edwards also claims that Kosminski suffered from schizophrenia and was later sent to an asylum. Does that line up with what we know about Kosminski from historical records?
Well, there are records that show Kosminski was admitted to an asylum. But, the diagnosis of schizophrenia is from Edwards. And we have to be really careful about using modern terms to describe mental illness back then. Our understanding of mental health has come a long way, and the term schizophrenia carried different meanings back in the 19th century.
Yeah, that's a really important point. It's so easy to project our modern understandings onto the past. Now, one thing that really stood out to me was that Edwards' findings haven't been published in any peer-reviewed scientific journals. There's been quite a bit of pushback from the scientific community about his conclusions. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, peer review is an essential part of the scientific method. It ensures that research is thoroughly evaluated by other experts in the field. And without it, it's much harder to gauge the validity of the claims.
That's a good point. That lack of transparency is definitely a red flag. However, despite the controversy, Edwards, along with 10 descendants of Catherine Eddowes, are pushing for legal recognition that Kosminski was the Ripper. This raises some interesting questions about the
possibility and the implications of posthumously identifying and charging someone. I mean, can you even do that?
It's definitely a complex legal and ethical issue. What would be the point of a trial like that? Would it really provide closure for the victims' families? And then there's a question of due process. How can you defend someone who's no longer alive to speak for themselves?
These are all thought-provoking questions. And before we get into the ethical and legal implications of this case, let's hear from our sponsor. Today's episode is brought to you by Black Diamond Authors, an independent publishing house dedicated to creating those gripping, thought-provoking books that keep you hooked. They offer a unique way to experience stories with everything from true crime puzzle books to interactive mystery experiences. If you're a fan of unraveling mysteries yourself, make sure to check them out at https://blackdiamondauthors.com. Okay, so back to Jack the Ripper. It seems like this push to officially recognize Kosminski as the killer is really driven by a desire for closure, especially for the victims' families. But what does closure actually mean in a case this old and this complex?
That's a really good question. Does putting a name to the monster, even after all these years, truly bring peace or understanding? Or does it just add another layer to an already intricate and complicated story? You know, it's amazing to think that we can use modern science to breathe new life into these old cases. Cases that were once considered unsolvable are now being reopened, thanks to things like DNA analysis.
Yeah, it's like we have this new time machine for evidence. And in this case, it's even more dramatic because there's this push for an actual trial, even though Kosminski is long gone. I mean, what would a trial like that even look like?
Well, a posthumous trial in a case like this would be completely unprecedented. You'd have to convince a court that the DNA evidence is absolutely irrefutable, which is tough with samples this old. Plus, how do you present a defense for someone who can't speak for themselves?
Right. It seems like a legal and ethical minefield. It really makes you wonder what's motivating this push for a trial.
Yeah.
If it's not about punishment, then what is it about?
Well, maybe it's about finally settling the debate once and for all. Maybe it's about finding some sense of justice for the victims, even if it's just symbolic.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
But is there ever really true closure in a case like this? Even if Kosminski's name is officially linked to the Jack the Ripper murders, there will always be people who doubt or come up with alternative theories.
Oh, absolutely. You know, this mystery has become so deeply ingrained in our culture that I almost think solving it would take away some of its allure. There's something about the unknown that captivates us. It lets our imaginations run wild.
It's like those choose-your-own-adventure books.
Yeah.
The reader gets to decide the ending, so the story never really ends. It just branches off in different directions.
That's a perfect analogy. And that's kind of what's happening with Jack the Ripper. Every new piece of evidence, every new theory just adds another layer to the story, making it even more complex and more fascinating.
Exactly. And speaking of fascinating stories, we want to hear from you, listener. What's your gut feeling on all this? Do you think this DNA evidence is enough to finally close the book on Jack the Ripper? Or does the mystery live on for you? But before you share your thoughts, let's take a quick detour back to the world of captivating storytelling with our sponsor. Visit https://blackdiamondauthors.com for fun and challenging true crime-themed puzzle books. All right, so we've talked a lot about the specifics of this case, but let's step back for a moment and think about the bigger picture. What does this whole story tell us about the potential of using modern science to re-examine these historical crimes?
Mo, it's a complete game changer. You know, cases that were once considered cold are now being reopened with advances in DNA analysis. This technology can not only identify perpetrators, but it can also clear the names of those who were wrongly accused. It can literally rewrite history.
Wow, yeah, it's like we have a brand new lens to view to pass through. We can revisit these old mysteries with fresh eyes and potentially uncover truths that were hidden for centuries.
And it's not just about uncovering the past, it's also about understanding how these historical narratives shape our present. You know, the case of Jack the Ripper, for example, still fascinates us because it speaks to our deepest fears and anxieties.
That's so true. It also shows our endless fascination with the darker side of human nature. Now, Edwards obviously feels very strongly about this case. He sees identifying Kosminski as Jack the Ripper as a way to honor the victims and bring them some sense of justice. But do you think that by focusing so much on the perpetrator, even with good intentions, we risk overshadowing the stories of the women who were murdered?
That's a really good point. It's a delicate balance. It's crucial to remember that these were real women with real lives. Their story shouldn't be lost in this quest to identify the killer. We need to be really mindful of the ethical implications of our fascination with true crime and make sure we're not exploiting the victims in the process.
I see what you mean. It's like we're so focused on solving the puzzle that we forget about the human cost of these crimes. The victims become just statistics or footnotes in the killer's story.
Exactly. We need to shift our focus from sensationalism to understanding. From the monster to the victims, we need to ask ourselves whose voices are being amplified and whose stories are being silenced.
Those are powerful questions. And listener, we want you to think about those as we continue our deep dive. What resonates most with you in this conversation? The power of science to unravel the past, the ethical dilemmas of posthumously trying someone, or the importance of centering the victim's narratives. These are all threads woven into the complex tapestry of the Jack the Ripper case, and we'll continue to explore them after a quick message. You know, it's fascinating how this case really makes us think about not just the limitations of historical investigations, but also the ethics of how we deal with the past.
Yeah, it's almost like time doesn't erase those questions of justice and accountability. It's a good reminder that the past never really stays settled. It always seems to find a way to influence and challenge us in the present.
Right, and we've covered so much ground today. From those chilling details of the Whitechapel murders to this controversial DNA evidence that claims to have finally unmasked Jack the Ripper.
We've really wrestled with those scientific advancements that make this kind of investigation even possible, the legal hurdles you have to jump through for a posthumous identification, and those ethical dilemmas that come with our fascination with true crime.
And through it all, there's that lingering question of closure. Can we ever truly find closure in a case like this? Or will the mystery of Jack the Ripper always be there in our collective imagination?
You know, maybe the biggest takeaway isn't about finding a definitive answer. Maybe it's about that journey of exploration itself. This deep dive has made us think critically about what evidence really means, the complexities of history, and how powerful storytelling can be.
I think you're right. This case, no matter what the final outcome might be, serves as a really powerful reminder that the past never really stays in the past. It shapes who we are today and how we understand ourselves.
And it shows us that the search for truth is rarely straightforward. It's a winding path full of unexpected twists and turns.
Absolutely. Before we wrap up, let's take a quick moment to mention something else you might find interesting. If you're intrigued by true crime and you love the challenge of solving mysteries, you should check out Black Diamond Authors. They have a wide range of books, including true crime puzzle books and interactive mystery experiences that will keep you engaged and entertained. Visit them at https://blackdiamondauthors.com. So as we come to the end of our deep dive into the world of Jack the Ripper, we want to leave you with this one final thought. What do you think is the most important aspect of this case? Is it the potential of DNA evidence to help us solve cold cases, the ethical issues around putting someone on trial after they've died, or is it about remembering and honoring the victims?
Whatever your takeaway, I hope this deep dive has sparked your curiosity and encouraged you to think critically about history, science, and justice.
I couldn't agree more. And to you, listener, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and stay curious.